He looked Hitler in the eye and said no. 3 times. Every other general who defied the Führer was executed within days. But this man walked out alive, and what he did next saved thousands of soldiers from pointless death. World War II produced some of the most famous military commanders in history. Patton, Rommel, Zhukov, MacArthur. These names are known everywhere. But there were other generals whose stories never made it into the history books. Generals who made decisions just as important, just as dangerous, but in the shadows. This is the story of one of them. A German general named Hans Speidel, and how his careful planning and moral courage changed the final months of the war in ways most people never learned about. Hans Speidel wasn't supposed to be a hero. He wasn't even supposed to survive the war. Born in 1897 in southern Germany, Speidel came from an academic family. His father was a teacher. The family valued education and culture. When World War I broke out, Speidel was just 17 years old. He joined the army like millions of other young Germans. He fought on the Western Front. He saw the horror of trench warfare. The mud, the gas attacks, the pointless charges that killed thousands for a few yards of ground. Unlike many officers who romanticized war, Speidel came away from World War I hating it. He saw war as a waste. A tragedy. But he stayed in the military after the war ended because Germany's army was one of the few stable institutions in the chaos of the 1920s. Speidel was smart. Really smart. He studied military history and strategy. He learned French fluently and studied French culture. He became an expert on France, which would become important later. During the 1930s, as Hitler rose to power, Speidel watched with growing concern. Speidel wasn't a Nazi. He never joined the Nazi Party. This was unusual for a German officer trying to advance his career. Most officers joined the party to get promotions. But Speidel refused. He kept his distance from Nazi ideology. He focused on being a professional soldier. When World War II started in 1939, Speidel was a staff officer. He helped plan operations but didn't command troops in the field. He was assigned to various headquarters positions. In 1940, during the invasion of France, Speidel served on the staff of the German forces. Germany won that campaign quickly and brutally. France fell in 6 weeks. After France surrendered, Speidel was assigned to the German military administration in Paris. This posting changed his perspective completely. He spent 2 years in Paris, from 1940 to 1942. During this time, Speidel got to know French intellectuals, artists, and resistance members. He maintained contacts with people who were actively opposing German occupation. This was incredibly dangerous. If the Gestapo or SS found out that a German general was socializing with French resistance sympathizers, Speidel would have been arrested and probably executed. But Speidel was careful. He believed that Germany was going to lose the war eventually, and when that happened, Germany would need friends in France. He was already thinking about the post-war world. In 1944, Speidel was called back to active military duty. He was assigned as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded German forces defending France against the expected Allied invasion. This assignment put Speidel at the center of one of the most critical campaigns of the entire war. Rommel and Speidel had worked together before and respected each other. But they were different men. Rommel was a fighter. Aggressive, bold, always looking for the attack. Speidel was a thinker. Careful, analytical, always considering consequences. When Speidel arrived at Rommel's headquarters in early 1944, the situation was tense. Everyone knew the Allies were going to invade France. The question was when and where. Rommel believed the invasion would come at Normandy. He wanted to build up defenses there. But Hitler and the High Command thought the invasion would come at Calais, farther north. Rommel was frustrated. He couldn't get the resources he needed to defend Normandy properly. Hitler kept interfering with military decisions. Orders came from Berlin that made no sense on the ground. Rommel complained to Speidel constantly about Hitler's micromanagement. But Rommel did more than complain. In private conversations with Speidel, Rommel started talking about ending the war. He said Germany couldn't win. The Allies were too strong. The Soviet Union was crushing German armies in the east. Continuing the war would just destroy Germany completely. Rommel thought Germany should seek a separate peace with the Western Allies. These conversations were treason. Just talking about making peace without Hitler's approval was enough to get you executed. But Rommel trusted Speidel. And Speidel agreed with Rommel's assessment. The war was lost. The only question was how to end it with minimal additional destruction. Then Rommel went further. He told Speidel that there was a conspiracy to remove Hitler from power. A group of German officers and civilians were planning to arrest or assassinate Hitler and then negotiate peace with the Allies. Rommel wasn't directly involved in the plot, but he knew about it and supported it. Speidel was now in an impossible position. He knew about a plot to kill Hitler. If the plot succeeded, he'd be safe. If it failed, everyone connected to it would be killed. And there was no way to know which way it would go. On June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion came. D-Day. Thousands of ships. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers landing on the beaches of Normandy. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. Rommel wasn't even at his headquarters when it started. He'd gone back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. Speidel was in command at headquarters. He received the first reports of the invasion and immediately understood how serious it was. This wasn't a diversion. This was the real invasion. And German forces weren't ready. Speidel made quick decisions to move reserves toward Normandy. But he couldn't get approval from higher command to release the panzer divisions. Hitler was asleep and nobody wanted to wake him. Hours were wasted while German commanders waited for permission to move their tanks. By the time Hitler woke up and gave approval, the Allies had established beachheads. Rommel rushed back to Normandy. Over the next weeks, German forces fought desperately to push the Allies back into the sea. But it was hopeless. The Allies had too much firepower. Too many men. Too much air support. German units were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Rommel told Speidel that Germany needed to end the war now. Not next month. Not next year. Now. Before all of France was destroyed. Before German cities were bombed to rubble. Before millions more people died for a war that was already lost. In July 1944, two things happened that changed everything. First, on July 17, Rommel's car was attacked by Allied fighters. Rommel was seriously wounded. He had a fractured skull and was unconscious. He was taken to a hospital and would be out of action for months. Speidel was now effectively in command of Rommel's army group, even though he didn't have the official authority. Second, on July 20, the plot to kill Hitler was executed. A bomb was planted in Hitler's headquarters during a meeting. The bomb exploded. But Hitler survived. He was injured but alive. And he was furious. Within hours, the Gestapo started arresting everyone connected to the plot. Hundreds of people were rounded up. Many were tortured to get names of other conspirators. Trials were held and sentences were swift. Execution. Almost everyone connected to the plot was killed. The Gestapo investigation led to Rommel. Under torture, some of the conspirators mentioned that Rommel had known about the plot. The Gestapo couldn't prove Rommel was directly involved, but they had enough to accuse him. Rommel was given a choice. Face a public trial for treason, which would humiliate his family and lead to their punishment. Or commit suicide quietly, and his family would be spared and he'd be given a state funeral as a war hero. Rommel chose suicide. On October 14, 1944, two generals came to Rommel's house. They gave him poison. Rommel said goodbye to his wife and son. He took the poison and died within minutes. The official story was that Rommel died from his injuries from the July air attack. Speidel knew exactly what had happened. He knew Rommel had been murdered by the Nazi regime. And he knew he was probably next. The Gestapo had been asking questions about Speidel's conversations with Rommel. They knew Speidel and Rommel had discussed ending the war. It was just a matter of time before they came for him. In late October, Speidel was arrested. He was taken to Berlin for interrogation. This was it. This was where Speidel expected to die. The Gestapo's interrogations were brutal. They tortured prisoners routinely. Most people told them everything within days. Then they were executed. But Speidel had one advantage. He was incredibly smart and disciplined. During interrogations, Speidel admitted to conversations with Rommel about military matters. He admitted that Rommel had been pessimistic about Germany's chances of winning. But he insisted that neither he nor Rommel had ever discussed killing Hitler or staging a coup. They'd talked about the military situation. That's all. The Gestapo couldn't break Speidel's story. They interrogated him for weeks. They threatened him. But they couldn't get him to confess to being part of the conspiracy. And without a confession, they couldn't execute him. The Nazi regime still cared about having some legal justification for killing people, at least when it came to high-ranking officers. So Speidel sat in prison for months. November. December. January 1945. The war was going badly for Germany. The Soviets were closing in from the east. The Western Allies were pushing into Germany from the west. The Reich was collapsing. But Speidel was still alive in his cell. Then something unexpected happened. In February 1945, Speidel was released from Gestapo custody. Not freed. Just transferred to Wehrmacht custody. The military took over his case from the secret police. This was huge. The Wehrmacht was much less likely to execute him than the Gestapo. Why was Speidel transferred? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe the Wehrmacht argued that they needed every experienced officer for the final defense of Germany. Maybe someone in the military command pulled strings to save him. Maybe the Gestapo just lost interest as the war situation became more desperate. Whatever the reason, Speidel was given a new assignment in March 1945. He was sent to command a defensive position in southern Germany. By this point, the war was clearly lost. Germany was being invaded from all sides. Hitler was in his bunker in Berlin, issuing insane orders that nobody could follow. The Nazi regime was in its death throes. And this is where Speidel made the decisions that saved thousands of lives. Speidel's orders were to defend his sector to the last man. No retreats. No surrenders. This was Hitler's standard order by this point. Fight until you die. Take as many enemies with you as possible. Hitler wanted Germany to go down fighting, even if it meant destroying what was left of the country. Speidel ignored these orders completely. He looked at the military situation and saw that resistance was pointless. American forces were going to overrun his sector no matter what he did. Fighting would just kill his soldiers and destroy the towns in the area. Civilians would die. Buildings would be destroyed. For what? The war was over in everything but name. So Speidel made plans to surrender his forces to the Americans with minimal fighting. But he had to be careful. There were still SS units in his area. There were Nazi Party officials who would report any general who talked about surrender. If Speidel openly ordered his troops to surrender, he'd be arrested and shot before he could carry out the order. Speidel worked through back channels. He sent messages to American forces through intermediaries. He indicated that his troops wouldn't fight if the Americans advanced. He positioned his forces in ways that wouldn't be effective for defense but would keep the SS from noticing anything suspicious. When the Americans advanced into his sector in April 1945, there was minimal resistance. German troops surrendered quickly. Towns were captured intact. Civilians were spared. The SS units that wanted to fight were isolated and quickly overwhelmed. Speidel had effectively handed over his entire command to the Americans without Hitler's approval. It was the final act of defiance. The final refusal to follow orders that would lead to pointless death. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Hitler had committed suicide a week earlier. The Nazi regime was gone. And Hans Speidel was still alive. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Speidel was held by the Americans as a prisoner of war. This was standard procedure. All German officers were detained and interrogated. The Allies wanted to figure out who was a war criminal and who was just a regular soldier. Speidel's interrogation was intense. The Americans wanted to know about his relationship with Rommel. They wanted to know what he knew about the July 20th plot. They wanted to know about German defensive plans. They wanted to know everything. Speidel cooperated fully. He had nothing to hide. He hadn't committed war crimes. He'd opposed Hitler. He'd tried to end the war early. He'd surrendered his forces to save lives. The Americans slowly came to realize that Speidel was different from most German generals they'd captured. But there was a complication. The French wanted to try Speidel for war crimes related to his time in Paris during the occupation. The French authorities accused him of being part of the occupation administration that had oppressed French citizens. Speidel's contacts with the French resistance during the war saved him. The resistance members he'd quietly helped testified that Speidel had been sympathetic to their cause. That he'd passed information to them. That he'd protected French intellectuals and artists from the Gestapo when he could. The French investigation concluded that Speidel hadn't committed crimes during the occupation. Speidel was released from custody in 1947. He was 50 years old. Germany was in ruins. The country was divided between Soviet and Western occupation zones. Millions were dead. Cities were destroyed. It would take decades to rebuild. Speidel could have retired. He could have disappeared into private life. Instead, he started working on something that seemed impossible. He started working to rebuild the German military as part of the Western Alliance. This sounds crazy. Germany had just been defeated in the worst war in history. Why would anyone want to rebuild the German military? But the world had changed. The Soviet Union was now seen as the threat. The Western powers wanted West Germany to be able to defend itself against potential Soviet aggression. They needed German military expertise. Speidel became one of the key architects of the new West German military. He worked with American and French officials to design a military force that would never again threaten its neighbors. A military that would be under civilian control. A military that would operate within a democratic system and respect human rights. In 1957, Speidel was appointed commander of NATO ground forces in Central Europe. A German general commanding Allied forces. Just 12 years after the end of the war. It was an incredible comeback. It showed how much trust Speidel had built with the Western powers. Speidel held this command until 1963. During this time, he helped train the new generation of German officers. He taught them that a military must serve the people, not a dictator. That soldiers have a duty to refuse illegal orders. That there are limits to obedience. These lessons came directly from his experience under Hitler. Hans Speidel's story is important because it shows that not all German generals were the same. We often think of World War II in simple terms. The Allies were good. The Germans were bad. But reality is always more complex. Speidel was a German general who actively opposed Hitler. Who worked with the resistance. Who tried to end the war early. Who refused to follow orders that would lead to pointless death. Who survived against all odds and then worked to build a democratic Germany. His planning and decision-making saved lives at critical moments. When he surrendered his forces to the Americans in April 1945, he saved the lives of his soldiers and the civilians in the towns that would have been destroyed in fighting. That's thousands of people who went home to their families instead of dying in the final days of a lost war. His refusal to confess under Gestapo interrogation probably saved his life. If he'd broken and told them everything, he'd have been executed like the other conspirators. His discipline and intelligence got him through the worst period. His work building the new German military helped ensure that Germany would never again become a threat to world peace. The German military today is completely different from Hitler's Wehrmacht. It operates under strict democratic control. It's integrated into NATO. It respects human rights. Speidel deserves credit for helping create that transformation. But Speidel's story also shows the tragedy of war. He spent years serving a regime he despised because he felt trapped by duty and circumstances. He saw friends killed. He saw his country destroyed. He survived, but at tremendous cost. The moral of Speidel's story is that individuals matter. Even in a totalitarian system where disobedience means death, individuals can still make choices. Those choices might be small. They might not change the course of the war. But they can save lives. They can preserve honor. They can plant seeds for a better future. Speidel made those choices repeatedly. Every time he refused to follow Hitler's suicidal orders. Every time he helped someone the regime wanted to destroy. Every time he told the truth instead of what the Nazis wanted to hear. These were acts of resistance. Small acts, maybe. But they mattered. World War II had thousands of generals. Most of them are forgotten. A few are famous. Speidel falls somewhere in between. Not famous enough for most people to know his name. But important enough that his story deserves to be told. Because his story reminds us that war isn't just about battles and strategy. It's about moral choices. About deciding what kind of person you want to be when everything around you is chaos and horror. About finding the courage to say no when everyone else is saying yes. Speidel said no to Hitler 3 times. When Hitler wanted to destroy Paris, Speidel opposed it. When Hitler wanted every soldier to fight to the death, Speidel found ways to save his men. When Hitler wanted total war until Germany was completely destroyed, Speidel worked to end it. And Speidel survived. Against all odds. Through luck and intelligence and discipline. He survived to help build a better Germany. A democratic Germany. A Germany that learned from its mistakes. That's the real victory. Not military glory. Not conquering territory. But surviving with your integrity intact and then working to make sure the horror never happens again. Hans Speidel died in 1984 at the age of 87. He lived long enough to see Germany reunified and at peace. He lived long enough to see the military he helped build become a force for stability rather than conquest. He lived long enough to know that his choices had mattered. His story isn't as dramatic as Patton's. It's not as well known as Rommel's. But it's just as important. Because Speidel represents something we need to remember about World War II. That even in the darkest times, even in the most evil systems, individuals can still choose to do the right thing. They can still resist. They can still save lives. And sometimes, against all odds, they can survive to tell the story. Watch the next video to learn about another general who changed history.